Autumn, 1944. A farmhouse kitchen in Clearwater, Texas. The air thick with cinnamon and something darker. Grief that hadn't finished its work. Emma Miller stood at her counter, flour dusting her trembling hands, while 12 German prisoners of war sat frozen at her table. These were the enemy, the same uniforms as the men who starved her son in a camp 3,000 miles away. For 3 months, her town had called her a traitor for using their labor to save her farm. For 3 months, she'd kept her distance, her rage carefully locked behind silence. They'd been taught Americans were monsters. She'd been taught Germans deserved nothing but hate. But then one boy, 19 years old, hollowed out by war, handed her a letter from his mother, and Emma saw her own grief staring back. So she did the one thing that made no sense. She baked. And when she placed that first slice of apple pie in front of Klaus, made with her last jar of preserves saved for a son who'd never come home, 12 young men broke. Not from cruelty, from kindness they'd been told didn't exist. Before we begin, if you want more untold stories that challenge everything you thought you knew about history, hit that subscribe button. And drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. I love seeing how far these stories reach. Emma Muller stood at the edge of her pecan orchard in the golden light of late September 1944, holding a letter she had read so many times the creases threatened to split the paper in two. The handwriting was her son's, neat and careful, the way she had taught him when he was 7 years old at the kitchen table. James had written it 3 weeks before he died, and the Red Cross had delivered it 4 months after his burial in France. Around her, the trees dropped their fruit early, thudding against the hard Texas soil with sounds like distant artillery. Without hands to harvest them, the pecans would rot where they fell. 40 years of her family's work turned to waste in a single season. She had tried to hire locally when the notice first came from the Department of Agriculture. Every able man was gone to war or working essential industry. The women had their own farms, their own children, their own impossible mathematics of survival. The notice had been clear and cold, as government paper always was. Failure to harvest would be classified as agricultural negligence in wartime. The land could be seized, redistributed to more productive management. Emma had built this farm with her husband before he died of pneumonia in '39. She had raised James here, taught him to graft trees and test soil and read weather in the color of the sky at dawn. She would not lose it to bureaucratic ink and empty fields. The sound of the truck reached her before she saw it, grinding up the dirt road in a cloud of pale dust. Military olive drab stenciled numbers on the door, a young corporal at the wheel who looked like he had graduated high school last spring. Emma folded James's letter carefully and slipped it into her apron pocket, then walked toward the house with her spine straight and her face empty of everything she felt. The truck stopped in front of the bunkhouse her husband had built for seasonal workers, back when there had been seasons and workers and a world that made sense. The corporal climbed out, clipboard in hand, and barely looked at her as he spoke. 12 prisoners from Camp Swift, German, captured in North Africa, processed through the system, assigned to agricultural labor under Geneva Convention protocols. She would provide drinking water and shade breaks. The guard would remain on site during work hours. Payment would go to the War Department. Did she have any questions? He said it like a statement, not an invitation. Emma had one question, but she did not ask it. She wanted to know if any of these men had been at Stalag 17, where her son had died of starvation and untreated illness, while his captors had food and medicine they chose not to share. She wanted to know if any of them had watched American boys waste away and felt nothing. But the corporal would not know, and asking would not change what she had to do, so she only nodded and said she understood. The prisoners filed out of the truck in a silent line, blinking in the bright Texas sun. They were younger than she expected, thinner. Their uniforms hung loose on frames that had forgotten what abundance felt like. Some had barely enough beard to shave. One stumbled on the step down, catching himself on the truck bed, and Emma's hand moved before her mind could stop it, reaching out to steady him. Then she saw the uniform, the eagle and swastika patch, and jerked back as if she had touched fire. The boy, and he was a boy, maybe 19, looked at her with eyes that expected a blow. She turned away. The corporal counted them off in bored English, then switched to German that sounded like he had learned it from a manual. They would sleep in the bunkhouse. Work began at dawn. No talking to the farmer, no leaving the work site. Attempts to escape would be met with appropriate force. The prisoners stood at attention, faces blank, and Emma wondered if they understood that this was mercy, that they were eating regular meals and sleeping in beds while boys like her son had died in cages. She wondered if they cared. That evening, after the prisoners were locked in the bunkhouse and the guard had driven away, Emma sat on her porch and watched the sun set over the orchard. The trees were heavy with fruit that needed picking, and tomorrow that would begin, and maybe she would save the farm after all. She should have felt relief. Instead, she felt hollowed out, scraped clean of everything except the simple animal need to survive another day. She heard the footsteps before she saw him. Roy Muller came up the porch stairs with his sheriff's badge catching the last light, his face set in, lines she recognized from 26 years of family dinners and holidays and the funeral where they had buried his brother. He looked at her the way he looked at drunks and thieves, and Emma felt something cold settle in her chest. Roy did not sit down. He stood at the edge of her porch and spoke in a voice that carried across the yard to where the bunkhouse windows glowed with dim light. She was putting them in James's bunkhouse. She was feeding Germans with rations her son had died to protect. This county would not forgive her. He would not forgive her. Then he unpinned his badge and set it on the porch rail between them, a line drawn in metal and broken loyalty, and walked away without waiting for her answer. By morning, someone had painted the word across her mailbox in red that looked like blood. Traitor. 4 syllables that turned her into a stranger in the only home she had ever known. The days fell into a rhythm stripped of everything human except labor. Emma woke before dawn, made coffee she drank alone, and set out 10 plates of food on the bunkhouse steps. Biscuits when she had flour, cornmeal mush when she did not. She never knocked, never waited. By the time she returned an hour later, the plates were empty and stacked with a neatness that felt like an apology she did not want to accept. The prisoners worked from first light until the heat made the air shimmer, then again in the evening when the worst had passed. Emma watched from a distance, counting bushels, calculating yield, speaking only to the guard when required. She never looked the prisoners in the eye. Klaus Hartmann organized the work details with quiet efficiency that surprised her. He divided the men into teams, rotating them between the heavy labor of climbing and the careful work of sorting, making sure the youngest ones got water first and the oldest ones got shade breaks they were too proud to ask for. Emma noticed this despite herself. She noticed how he checked on each man at midday, a hand on a shoulder, a quiet word in German she could understand but pretended not to. He was keeping them alive, keeping them functional, the way a good corporal kept his unit moving when everything else had fallen apart. The youngest one, Werner, cried at night. Emma heard him through the bunkhouse walls when she walked to the barn after dark, thin, broken sounds that reminded her of the way James had cried as a little boy when he skinned his knee or lost a favorite toy. She hardened her heart against the sound. This boy was fed and safe and would go home when the war ended. Her son was in a grave in France, 22 years old forever, and no amount of crying would balance that scale. But there was an older man, Friedrich, who moved like every step cost him something. His left leg dragged slightly, an old injury poorly healed, and by mid-afternoon his face went gray with pain he never mentioned. He should not have been in a uniform at all. He was old enough to be these boys' father, maybe their grandfather, drafted in the desperate final sweeps when Germany started running out of young men to feed into the machine. Emma watched him climb a ladder with grim determination, favoring the bad leg, refusing help from the others, and something in her chest pulled tight with an anger that had nowhere useful to go. The town made sure she understood the cost of her choice. At church on Sunday, the pew beside her stayed empty, even when latecomers had to stand in the back. Martha Jennings, who had brought casseroles after James died, crossed the street when she saw Emma coming. The general store clerk told her they were out of sugar, then sold a pound to the woman behind her in line without blinking. Someone left a dead rat on her porch. Emma cleaned it up without comment, buried it behind the barn, and went back to work. She had survived her husband's death and her son's death. She would survive this too. On the 8th day, Klaus collapsed in the south field. Emma was checking the irrigation channels when she heard the shout, saw the cluster of prisoners gathering in a tight knot under the pecan trees. The guard was yelling in English for them to get back to work, his rifle held across his chest like a barrier. Emma ran. She did not think about it. Her body moved before her mind could object, the same instinct that had made her run when James fell out of the oak tree at age 9, when her husband could not catch his breath in the final pneumonia hours. Klaus was on the ground, skin flushed and dry, eyes half open and unfocused. Heat stroke. Emma had seen it before, seen men die from it when they were too stubborn or too poor to stop working. She grabbed his arm, shouted at the guard in English sharp enough to cut. "He is just a boy. Get me water. Now!" The guard stared at her like she had started speaking in tongues. Emma did not wait. She dragged Klaus into the shade, her hands under his arms, his weight almost nothing, and yelled at Werner to bring the canteen. She switched to German without meaning to, the language of her childhood rushing back after years of careful English only. "Drink. Slowly. Do not gulp." Her hands were shaking as she pressed the cool metal to his lips, as she tilted his head back, as she pulled off his cap and poured water over his hair and neck. Klaus blinked up at her, confusion cutting through the haze, and said in halting English that made the words cost him something. "You speak." Emma froze. The other prisoners were watching. The guard was watching. She had just revealed the secret she had kept for 3 months, the fluency that let her understand every word they said to each other when they thought no one was listening. She stood up, handed the canteen to Friedrich, and walked away without answering. Her hands were still shaking. She scrubbed them on her apron like she could wash away the moment of weakness, the crack in the wall she had built between herself and these men who wore the uniform of her son's killers. That night, she could not sleep. She sat at her kitchen table with James's letters spread in front of her, reading them for the 100th time, looking for something she could not name. In one letter, he described teaching a French child to say hello in English. In another, he wrote about sharing his rations with a starving dog. He had been kind even in the middle of war, even when kindness made no tactical sense. Emma did not know if that had made him weak or strong, only that it had made him her son, and she had loved him for it. The next morning, she left a note in the bunkhouse with the breakfast plates. It was written in German, 3 short lines. "Drink before noon. Shade time 2 to 4. The handwriting was her mother's, the language her father had forbidden her to speak in public after they came to Texas when Emma was 8 years old and trying desperately to belong. She signed it with her initials and walked away before anyone could see. The harvest succeeded. Week by week, the bushels filled, the pecans sorted and bagged and ready for market. Emma kept meticulous records, counting every pound, calculating what she would owe in taxes and what might be left to carry her through winter. The numbers said she would survive. The farm would survive. It should have felt like victory, but victory had stopped meaning anything the day the telegram came about James. She began to notice things she had tried not to see. Klaus fixed the broken fence along the north pasture without being asked, found wire and posts in the barn, and spent an evening after work hours making it right. Emma discovered it the next morning, tested the tension of the wire, and felt something uncomfortable twist in her chest. Werner sang while he worked, old folk songs in German that reminded her of her grandmother's kitchen, and the younger prisoners joined in with harmonies that turned labor into something almost bearable. Friedrich carried a photograph in his shirt pocket, pulled it out during water breaks to look at a girl with dark braids who smiled at the camera like the world was safe. Emma saw it once when he set it on a stump to wipe sweat from his hands. The girl looked exactly the age James would have been. She tried to hold on to her anger, but anger required energy she no longer had. The town's shunning continued. Someone slashed her truck tire. The minister asked her politely not to serve on the church hospitality committee anymore, said folks were uncomfortable given the situation, said surely she understood. Emma understood perfectly. She was being erased from the community she had spent 40 years building, one small rejection at a time, payment for the sin of choosing survival over symbolic loyalty. Klaus found a magazine in the bunkhouse left behind by a previous work detail or maybe brought by the guard. Life magazine, July issue, with photographs of German prisoners in American camps. Clean bunks, hot meals, men playing cards, and writing letters home under electric lights. He studied the pictures with an expression Emma could not read, sitting on the bunkhouse steps in the evening light while the others prepared for sleep. She watched from her kitchen window, hidden behind the curtain, and wondered what he was thinking. Wondered if he was comparing these images to whatever propaganda he had been fed about American brutality, about camps that were supposed to be death factories. The next day, Klaus worked with something different in his posture, less defensive, less braced for cruelty that never came. He smiled at Werner's singing, actually smiled, and Emma realized she had never seen any of them smile before. They had been waiting for the other shoe to drop, for the moment when kindness revealed itself as a trap. But weeks had passed, and they were still fed and housed and treated according to rules that apparently meant something, and the cognitive dissonance was breaking something open in Klaus that had been sealed shut by years of propaganda. The package arrived on a Tuesday, forwarded through military channels with stamps and signatures Emma did not bother reading. Inside was James's final effects. His dog tags on a chain worn smooth by sweat and friction. His wallet with $3 and a photograph of her standing in the orchard. His wedding ring, the one his father had worn first, which James had carried even though he was not married because someday he had planned to be. And letters. 3 letters he had written but never sent, confiscated when he died because the censors had to review everything, even correspondence from the dead. Emma read them alone in her bedroom with the door locked and the curtains drawn. The first 2 were ordinary. Updates about weather and food and the French countryside, complaints about his sergeant, questions about the farm. But the 3rd letter was different. James described capturing a young German soldier during a skirmish, a boy who could not have been more than 17, who cried and begged for his mother in broken English. James had been ordered to secure him for interrogation, but the boy was wounded and terrified and kept saying he was sorry. He was sorry. He did not want to fight. James wrote that he looked exactly like Tommy Harrison from school. Same build, same frightened eyes, and James could not do it. He let the boy go, pointed him toward the German lines and told him to run. Then James wrote the line that broke Emma into pieces she did not know how to reassemble. "I know you will be disappointed in me, Ma, but I could not kill someone's son when he was not trying to kill me. I hope that does not make me a coward. I hope it makes me the man you raised." Emma sat on her bed and wept for the first time since the telegram. Not from disappointment, from pride so fierce it burned. Her son had chosen mercy in the middle of war. He had seen a human being where he was supposed to see an enemy, and he had let that boy live. And maybe that boy made it home to his mother, and maybe that mattered more than all the tactical victories in France. James had died believing he had failed her. He had died not knowing that his mercy was the only thing about the war that made any sense. The harvest ended 3 days later. The last bushels loaded onto the truck, the fields cleared, the trees ready to rest through winter. The prisoners would ship out in the morning to another work site, another farm that needed hands. On their last evening, Klaus approached Emma where she stood by the barn, watching the sunset turn the sky the color of fire. He spoke in careful English, each word chosen with the precision of someone working in a language that did not come naturally. "Thank you. You show us we were told lies. You are good people." Emma looked at him, really looked at him for the first time. 19 years old, thin and exhausted and so far from home. A boy who had been taught to hate and was learning slowly and painfully that hate was a lie. She felt her face move into something that might have been a smile. You worked hard. You earned it. There was a moment of peace between them, a sense that maybe across the wreckage of war, understanding was possible, that maybe mercy could survive even when everything else burned. Emma went to bed that night feeling something almost like hope. Roy arrived just after midnight with a telegram in his hand and murder in his eyes. Emma heard the truck before she saw the headlights, the sound of gravel under tires pulling her from shallow sleep. She knew it was Roy before he knocked. No one else came to her door after dark anymore, and no one else knocked like that, hard and official, the way sheriffs knocked when the news could not wait for morning. She wrapped her robe around her and opened the door to find him standing on her porch with a telegram in one hand and something terrible in his face. The Red Cross had sent it through official channels, forwarded from Camp Swift because Emma was listed as next of kin. A report compiled from debriefings of liberated prisoners and captured German records. James had died at Stalag 17B, but not the way the first telegram had said. Not quickly from wounds sustained in combat. He had died slowly over 3 weeks, starved and beaten, denied medical care for pneumonia that could have been treated with basic antibiotics the Germans had but chose not to share. The report included testimony from other prisoners who survived. They described watching American boys waste away while their captors ate full meals. They described guards who laughed when prisoners begged for medicine. They described James asking for his mother in the final delirium before his lungs filled with fluid and stopped working. Roy watched Emma read it twice, watched her face go white and then empty of everything. He said the words she could not yet form. They killed him, Emma, not in battle. In a cage. They tortured him for 3 weeks and let him die. And you have been feeding them, sheltering them, treating them like guests. Emma looked toward the bunkhouse where soft light glowed in the windows, where 12 German prisoners were settling in for their last night before transport, where Klaus and Werner and Friedrich slept in beds with clean sheets and full stomachs. The prisoners who received wages and medical care and Geneva Convention protections. The prisoners who were safe and fed while her son had died begging for mercy that never came. Something white and cold flooded through her, washing away every soft feeling she had allowed herself over the past weeks, every moment of hesitation, every flicker of recognition that they were human too. She walked back inside without answering Roy, closed the door, and stood in her dark kitchen with her hands braced on the counter. James's photograph watched her from the shelf above the sink, 22 years old in his uniform, smiling the way he smiled when he was trying to be brave. She had been soft. She had been weak. She had let herself forget what they were, what they had done. She had read his letter about Mercy and thought it meant something, but Mercy had gotten her son killed, and these boys were alive, and there was no justice anywhere in that equation. Morning came cold and gray. Emma walked to the bunkhouse before dawn and set the breakfast plates down with a sound like dropped stones. When Klaus emerged and tried to catch her eye, tried to say good morning in his careful English, she turned away. The guard arrived at 7 to supervise the final half-day of work, repairs to the storage shed that needed finishing before transport. He asked Emma if she wanted them to complete it. She said no. They were done. Get them out. Klaus stood very still, trying to understand what had changed. We did something wrong, he asked in English that broke on the edges. Emma switched to German, the language she had been hiding for months, and let every word cut. Your people killed my son. He starved in your cages while you ate my food. Get out, all of you. Get out of my sight. The prisoners froze. Werner started crying, the thin, desperate sound of someone who had learned that safety was always temporary. Friedrich said quietly in German that they were sorry, that they did not choose this war, that they grieved for her loss. Emma cut him off. Neither did my boy. But he is dead and you are alive. There is no justice in that. There is no mercy in that. You should have died instead of him. All of you should have died instead of him. She went back inside and slammed the door, stood in her kitchen with her whole body shaking and tried to find satisfaction in the cruelty, tried to feel righteous, tried to feel anything except the hollow certainty that hurting them did not bring James back, did not balance anything, did not make the math of grief add up to something bearable. Roy arrived at noon with a crowd. Emma heard them before she saw them, voices carrying across the yard, men and women from town who had been waiting for permission to act on their anger. Someone had told them the prisoners were leaving. Someone had decided it was time to send a message. Roy stood at the front with rope in his hands, and Emma understood with sick clarity what he meant to do, what the crowd meant to do. Teach them how we treat murderers, Roy said loud enough for everyone to hear. Show them what happens when you kill American boys. The prisoners huddled together near the bunkhouse, backs against the wall, eyes wide with the recognition that mercy had an expiration date and theirs had just run out. Klaus was shaking. Werner was praying in German under his breath. Friedrich stood in front of the younger ones like a shield made of flesh and old wounds, ready to die first if dying was inevitable. Emma stood on her porch and watched. She had every reason to let this happen, every right to turn away, every justification that rage could provide. The town was offering her vindication, offering her revenge, offering her the chance to balance the scales with blood, the way blood had been taken from her. Klaus reached into his pocket with trembling hands and pulled out a folded piece of paper, thin and worn from reading. He could not read English well, Emma knew that, knew he struggled with anything beyond basic commands. But he held the letter out toward her like an offering, like a white flag, like the last desperate gamble of someone who had nothing left to lose. "Please," he said in broken English, "just read." Emma took the letter from Klaus's shaking hands and unfolded it carefully. The paper was thin as tissue, worn soft from repeated handling, covered in handwriting that leaned hard to the right like it had been written in a hurry or by someone whose hand cramped from cold. It was in German, sent through the Red Cross mail system that allowed prisoners to receive limited correspondence from home. The date was May of 1944, 4 months old, and Emma could see where Klaus had folded and refolded it so many times the creases had nearly split through. The letter was from Klaus's mother. She wrote about their village outside Hamburg, bombed to rubble in a raid that lasted 3 hours. She described digging through the wreckage of their home to salvage a single cooking pot and her mother's Bible. She had not heard from Klaus's father in over a year, not since Stalingrad, and the silence meant he was almost certainly dead because the lists of prisoners had been published and his name was not on them. Klaus's little sister Anna, 10 years old, had been killed in the bombing. She had been at school when the sirens went off and the school took a direct hit and there was nothing left to bury except a shoe they found in the rubble that might have been hers. The mother wrote that she was living in a church basement with 40 other women and children, that they had one meal a day if they were lucky, that she sold her wedding ring to buy bread, and it was not enough. She wrote that the propaganda on the radio kept promising victory, but the city was ash and the men were gone and victory looked like slow starvation. Then she wrote the lines that broke Emma's heart into pieces that could not be put back together the same way. If you are alive, if someone is kind to you, thank them. Tell them we are not all monsters. Tell them we are also grieving. Tell them we did not choose this, and we are paying for it anyway, and maybe someday the war will end and we can all start trying to remember how to be human. Emma's hands were shaking. She looked up at Klaus, 19 years old, who had lost his father and his sister and his home, who had been drafted at 17 and taught to kill for a cause that had destroyed everything he loved. She looked at Werner, who cried at night for a mother in Bavaria who had already lost 3 sons and sent the 4th away because she had nothing left to feed him. She looked at Friedrich, who carried a photograph of a daughter who worked in a munitions factory and a wife who burned to death in the Hamburg firestorms. She saw her own grief reflected in 12 faces, 12 boys and men who had not chosen war any more than James had chosen it, who were just as trapped, just as broken, just as desperate to survive long enough to go home to ruins. The crowd was shouting. Roy was advancing with the rope. Someone threw a rock that hit the bunkhouse wall with a crack like a gunshot. Emma turned to face them. These people she had known her entire adult life, these neighbors who had brought casseroles and prayed with her and shared pews and harvest and the ordinary intimacy of small-town survival. She saw rage in their faces, the rage of people who had sent sons and brothers and husbands to die and needed someone to punish for it. She understood that rage. She had felt it burning in her chest for hours, white-hot and righteous. But she also understood something else now, something James had tried to tell her in his last letter. Emma stepped between the crowd and the prisoners. "No," she said. Her voice was steady even though her whole body was shaking. Roy stared at her like she had lost her mind. Emma, they killed James. Emma shook her head. And James chose mercy. He wrote it in his last letter. He let a German boy live because he saw a human being. If I let you do this, I lose him twice. I lose everything he tried to be. Everything he died believing mattered. Roy looked at the rope in his hands, then at Emma, then at the prisoners huddled against the wall. The crowd shifted, uncertain, waiting for someone to decide what happened next. Emma turned to the prisoners and spoke in German, her voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "Come inside, now, all of you." She walked toward her house, toward the kitchen where she had fed her family for 20 years, and the prisoners followed because they had no other choice and no other protection. The crowd parted, stunned into silence by the sheer audacity of it. Emma led 12 German prisoners into her home for the first time, into the space she had kept sacred and separate, and closed the door behind them. They stood in her kitchen, awkward and terrified, while Emma went to the pantry and pulled out her carefully hoarded ration sugar, her last jar of canned apples that she had been saving for James's return, flour and butter and cinnamon. Klaus whispered in German, asking what she was doing. Emma answered in German, tears streaming down her face. "Making apple pie, like my mother taught me, like I taught my son, because that is what we do. We feed people, even when we are angry, even when it hurts, because feeding people is how we stay human when everything else tries to make us into monsters." She worked in silence, her hands moving through the familiar motions, cutting butter into flour, rolling dough, slicing apples thin and even. The prisoners watched without speaking, without understanding, only knowing that something profound was happening and they were part of it. The smell began to fill the house, cinnamon and sugar and butter, the smell of home and safety and every kitchen across every border where mothers made food for the people they loved. When the pie was ready, Emma cut it into 12 pieces. She handed the first slice to Klaus on her good china, the plate she used for Christmas and Easter. "Sit," she said in German. "Eat." Klaus took the plate with shaking hands, looked at the golden crust and the steam rising from the apples, and took a bite. The first taste of sweetness in 3 years. The first act of genuine kindness without calculation or expectation. The taste of someone saying you are worth feeding, you are worth saving, you are human, and that matters. Klaus broke. Tears poured down his face, and then Werner was crying, and then all of them. 12 young men weeping over apple pie because it was the first time since the war began that someone had treated them with simple, uncomplicated dignity. Emma watched them cry and felt her own rage crack open, not disappearing but transforming into something else, something that could hold both her grief and their humanity at the same time. Outside, Roy stood on the porch watching through the window. He saw his brother's wife feed the enemy with her son's sugar ration. He saw her become what his brother had died defending, not revenge but restraint, not hatred but the harder choice of mercy. He took off his hat, backed away quietly, and the crowd dissolved behind him.